Welcome to the 18th season of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Thank you. For how many of you is this Dayton Literary Peace Prize weekend one of your favorite weekends of the year? Yeah. My name is Nick Rains, and I have the privilege of being the executive director of this incredible organization which impacts so much change, advancing peace through literature. First, I want to thank my friend, Rhonda Chamble, the majority owner of Dayton's Iron Gate Realtors, for being tonight's presenting sponsor. Please help me in welcoming Rhonda. This is Rhonda's third consecutive year to do this for us, so that's absolutely incredible. Thanks. Additionally, we would not be here tonight were it not for the vision and work and dreams of Sharon Rabb. Sharon is the founder of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Sharon, please stand. Please stand. I'll probably get a talking to later. As always, this year's first readers and judges led us down a path to a rich and diverse collection of literary work that captures the full breadth of what the Dayton Literary Peace Prize means by peace. These books so deftly explore issues of race, class, labor, feminism, climate change, and a human's ability to evolve and adapt to adversity, both physically and mentally. Our MC tonight is one of Dayton's favorites, Mr. Gilbert King. In addition to being a former DLPP honoree himself, Gilbert is also a recipient of the Pulitzer Prize, and most recently, Gilbert won iHeartRadio's Podcast of the Year for his podcast, Bone Valley. Right? Gilbert, come on out, Gilbert. Gilbert, they love you. They love you. Gilbert has dedicated his life's work, even put himself in danger, and I've heard some of the stories, in the pursuit of justice on behalf of those who get taken advantage of by the system. So thank you for being with us, and thank you for spending some time with us. Ladies and gentlemen, Gilbert King.
Thank you. My pleasure. Great job, Nick. Thank you. It's really just so nice, as always, to be back here in this beautiful setting. I think last time we read the bios, I'm going to ask you kindly to refer to your programs so that we don't do a 15-minute introduction of all the authors, because the honors and awards that these guys have is pretty astonishing. So instead of that, we're going to have a beautiful conversation tonight, but instead of reading the bios, I'm just going to basically just announce who they are and what they're here for. So we're going to start out with the 2023 nonfiction runner-up for American Midnight, Adam Hochschild. Welcome, sir. We now have the 2023 fiction runner-up for her novel, The Light Pirate, Lily Brooks Dalton. Welcome, Lily. And for the 2023 nonfiction winner for His Name is George Floyd, two authors. We'll start with Tolu Oloripa. Welcome, Tolu. And his co-author for the same book, Robert Samuels. And last, but certainly not least, our 2023 fiction winner for her novel Horse, Geraldine Brooks. Please be seated, everyone. Okay. Since you were last, Geraldine, I'll ask you first. You know, writing this book, I'm always interested about people who are writing during the last couple of years because it was the pandemic. For you, we saw a white supremacist rioting in Charlottesville, the murder of George Floyd. How did those events shape the way you wrote Horse?
It was a jackhammer. The story of race in America was not what I set out to write about when I was attracted to the story of the fastest racehorse of the 19th century. But I soon found that I would be writing about the talent and skill of the enslaved black horseman whose plundered labor made this horse's success possible. And I also had a contemporary thread to the novel, so I couldn't leave that story in the 19th century as if it was something over and done with, when there was the jackhammer of deaths, one after the other. George Floyd, Sandra Bland, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many names, a litany of names. And it just seemed that this would have to reverberate in the book, and so it does.
Yeah, good answer. You know, just springboarding. Tolu, I'm going to start with you just because we just mentioned George Floyd. You know, this is a subject of his death in 2020. It was something that I think everybody knows about. But reading your book, I was continually surprised by everything I did not know. And can you just talk about, you know, what you discovered in your research in this story that surprised even you? And Robert, you can feel free to jump in as well.
Yeah, so we've all seen, most of us have seen the video of George Floyd dying. We learned a lot about how he lived, and in our research, which took us to Houston and Minneapolis and Washington, D.C., and so many other places where we talked to more than 400 people, all the way from the person on the corner that was with George Floyd when he was growing up as a little kid in an impoverished neighborhood, to the President of the United States, who was responsible for some of the policies that influenced George Floyd's life. We learned, one, about George Floyd the man, George Floyd the person, the human being who was an American just like the rest of us, who was striving and trying to make his way through this country despite a number of obstacles that were placed in his way. And we learned about the America that he grew up in, an America that, for people like George Floyd, poor, black, impoverished, and having a number of statistical odds stacked against you, it's not necessarily the country that provides the American dream in the same way that we think about it. And despite that, we saw that George Floyd continued to strive. He was a gregarious person. He was a humorous person. He was someone that battled his flaws and struggled with a number of different traumas. And despite that, he continued to sort of pick himself up and try to make a better path for himself. So he left Houston, moved to Minneapolis, where he ultimately was killed. We learned that he left Houston because he was trying to start a new life. He was trying to get over drug dependency. He was trying to get to a place where, he might find a little bit more grace than the tough Southern experience that he had in Texas, where, in addition to tough criminal justice laws, there are very difficult laws that make it difficult for someone who has a criminal record to get employment. And so he moved to Minneapolis trying to find a better path. And for a part of his time in Minneapolis, before he met Derek Chauvin, before the pandemic shut everything down, he was on a better path. And we learned about sort of how he was starting to make his way and starting to make a path, getting a job, starting to get into truck driving, starting to find a better relationship with his family. And so we learned about how even when you strive and you try, a lot of times in this country that's not enough, especially if there are institutional barriers as well as things outside of your control that can go against you. That's what happened in George Floyd's life. We learned that, yes, he was killed by a police officer, an agent of the state, in a heinous 9-minute, 29-second encounter, but the 46 years that he was trying to strive and trying to breathe was also heinous and difficult and trying. And in a lot of ways, it's very easy for us to not see those 46 years and just see the video. But we learned in writing the book that we have to train our attention on the striving and the trying and the trauma that he faced when he was just a regular black man trying to make it in America.
And Robert, I just was struck not just from the biographical elements of this story, but also the history and the sociology that you guys explored. You talk about that?
Sure. Whoa. There are a few really interesting things. When we started thinking about the book, we had two real big questions. First question was, who was George Floyd? And the second question was, what was it like to live in his America? And to do that, not only did we think about people who had known George Floyd, but we talked to people who are much smarter and much more experienced in different things than us, about the education system, the housing system, healthcare, licensing, land loss, all of these different parts and fragments of George Floyd's life that help really shape an American tapestry. And some of the amazing thing is every time we spoke with one of these experts about who had kind of supposed something that might have happened to the Floyds, that being George Floyd and his family, you saw reverberations of that. For example, if you think about why George Floyd was poor, why George Floyd grew up poor, you go back to the 1850s and you discover that his great-great-grandfather had owned 500 acres of land in North Carolina, making him one of the wealthiest people, not black people, within that county, but within a generation. And the reverberations in books, within a generation, all of that was taken away through tax schemes, through fraudulent practices that took advantage of the fact that when his great-grandfather was growing up, he was not allowed to read, right? And so what does that do to a family when they see the stripping of an American dream? How that gets passed along, how that shapes their American experience, right? Then you see them try to move from North Carolina to Houston, Texas, to a neighborhood redlined because the federal government designed it to be that way. They wanted it to be that way in an education system where when it was supposed to integrate, people decided they didn't want to do it. They moved with their feet. And when the courts forced teachers to integrate, George Floyd's school, all black, did not get the best white teachers, but the white schools got the best black teachers. And you think about how that forms the experience, all the way up to thinking about him falling into this heinous trap that happens to millions of Americans in the opioid crisis. One of the interesting things we learned was 3 weeks before George Floyd had died, the state of Minnesota put out a note saying, we've messed up. We've been looking at opioids in these parts of our state, but there is a big issue in this part of our state. That was the place where George Floyd was living. And so when we think about his life, right, it's not simply his agency that we think about. We think about what we can learn from how he tried to navigate all these gaping holes in our social safety net, right? And I think when we do that, it forces us to really question why those holes exist and what we can do to think about patching some of them up.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah. Adam, I'm going to pivot to you a little bit because American Midnight documents the years 1917 to 1921. When extremism reached a new level, perhaps unseen, I'm not sure, but can you just put that past in the context of where we are today, but focus on the past in this question?
Well, this is a period that had always fascinated me. Even though the First World War happened long before I was born, it always somehow resonated in the background of my childhood. I felt I had two personal connections to it. One was that my mother had grown up as the daughter of a professor at Princeton University. Woodrow Wilson was president of Princeton up until 2 years before he went into the White House. He actually continued to, as governor of New Jersey during those 2 years, to live in Princeton until he moved into the White House. And on election night 1912, my grandfather took his 3 daughters, my mother was one of 3, over to Wilson's house to congratulate him on being elected president. And then she was a teenager when World War I came and described to me how very exciting it was to see all these handsome young men on the campus walking around in uniform and marching in formation, and there was an airfield on the outside of town. And then she was absolutely devastated when two much beloved cousins of hers were killed in the war. So I sort of heard about that from her. My father was of draft age, living in New York City when World War I came, but he was desperate to get into the military. Why? Because his family had come from Germany, and he was Jewish at a time when there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the US. They spoke German at home, but he told me, if you got caught speaking German on the street in those years, you could get beaten up because there was so much hysteria in the air. So he tried desperately to get into the Army, wasn't able to do so because he had bad eyesight, but was finally able to go to work as a civilian for the federal government. So for him, the war was a time of terror because of this nationalist fever in the air. And then the more I learned about it, the more I realized first the extent to which the First World War had remade the world for the worse in every conceivable way. Simon Schama calls it the original sin of the 20th century. And the more I began to realize that there were people in all of the participating countries who had some sense of that as it was happening. And I wrote a book some dozen years ago that brought me to Dayton for the first time about war resistors in Britain during the First World War, but I knew they had many counterparts in the United States. I wanted to explore it. And in the course of exploring that, I began to realize in a deeper way than I had before just how severe the political repression in this country was during those 4 years. And I think it was really the politically most repressive period in American history since the immediate aftermath of slavery.
Wow. Lily, as someone who spends a lot of time in Florida myself, your description of this catastrophic storm that's bearing down on the state was absolutely terrifying to me. And this is going to be the end of Florida as we know it. And no, it's not a feel-good novel, by the way. Some of you are not. We love Florida. But what inspired you to take on this subject? What were you hoping to explore with this?
Well, I've always been fascinated by Florida. I didn't grow up there. I grew up in Vermont, but when I was 20, my parents decided to move to Florida. And at first, I was like, why? Why Florida? And I didn't understand the choice. But since then, I've spent a lot of time there, and I've sort of pricked my ears to the way that people talk about Florida. It's always seems to be the butt of a joke. And there's something, there's something to that didn't feel quite right to me. Like, obviously there are problems in Florida, and there are problems in lots of other states, but why do we kind of shunt so much of our unease onto this one place? And I think, Florida is geographically, politically, kind of an edge. It's embodying two states at once, and I mean states, not like two beings at once in terms of, here's the ocean, here's the land, here's the swamp, but also Democrats, Republicans. Like, there's so many things merging in Florida, and it's a tumultuous place to set a novel. So, and then you throw in some drastic weather, and you've got a book. So.
Yeah, the expression I always hear about Florida is, the further north you get, the further south you get. And Tolu, you grew up in northern Florida. Can you just talk about that? Like, what's the difference between your vision of South Florida, where this book is set, and up where you're in Tallahassee?
Yeah, I grew up in Tallahassee, and both Robert and I were cub reporters at the Miami Herald, where we started. So we got, the flavor of the different parts of the state. And George Floyd actually spent some time in college in Florida, and so Florida always seems to have sort of a role to play in so many different things, from the 2000 election to the fact that our former president and current frontrunner for the Republican nomination now is a Floridian. It just is a place where there's a lot happening. And one of the things we learned as cub reporters, is that it's a great place to be a reporter. It's a great place to mine for stories. One, because there's always something crazy happening. Two, because there's really great public records laws, and so you could find out why something crazy is happening. And three, because there are crazy politicians in Florida, and they're usually the ones causing the crazy things to be happening. The other thing about Florida, and this connects to the brief scene in our book that it's based there, is that it's a place where a lot of people go seeking sort of a fresh start. George Floyd was a high school football star, and he made it to the state championship in Texas in a very Friday Night Lights sort of scene where you've got 20, 30,000 people going to high school football games. And that was what dominated in his high school. It was all-black school, underfunded, under-resourced, not a lot of support for the academic part of school, but one of the best football high schools in the state. They had won, state championship. They had all kinds of college and recruiters coming to the school for athletics, not much for academics. And so George Floyd saw that as his pathway out of impoverished circumstances of his neighborhood. He thought, he's got, a big body, he's strong, he's fast, he's athletically gifted. That's the way he's going to be able to make it out of Houston's Third Ward. But after that process started to unravel for him, in part because of the lack of academic support he had, he couldn't pass the high school examination test that you need to graduate high school. He saw all those college recruiters start to fade away and say, if you can't make it out of high school, then you can't come to college. And so the one saving grace he had was a community college in Florida that had a sports team and had someone that was willing to take a chance on him and said, you're not going to be able to make it in Texas now because you haven't been able to graduate, but I'm going to give you some support. You can get your GED and you can come down and play sports, and maybe you'll be able to transfer to a bigger school later. And so he spent a couple years in Florida chasing his athletic dreams. He was able to get his GED, and he was able to get some college experience, which for someone coming from his kind of community was an aberration from the norm, the fact that he was even able to get into college. And so Florida was a place where he was able to start chasing that dream. But as we unfurled in the book, there are so many times where his dreams became dreams deferred or dreams diminished or dreams derailed, in part because of these institutional structures, including the sports world, including college athletics, including a lot of the things that can be positive in a lot of ways, but can have a dark underbelly. And so George Floyd ended up leaving Florida, going back to Texas, and trying to continue his athletic career, but eventually hit a brick wall without having the academic undergirding that he would need to be able to pass his classes and get on the field. And then he ended up having to go back to Third Ward. And when he was back in Third Ward without a sports deal, without an academic degree, he found himself facing the next trapdoor, facing people that looked like him, which was the criminal justice system and the police that were circling around his community looking for anyone that could make the smallest mistake, even in a nonviolent way. And as soon as that happened, there was sort of this spiral that we get into in the book, and we get into the dangers of the drug war and the difficulties that people that look like George Floyd face for often nonviolent actions that are happening across the city, happening across the country, but are policed in different ways, policed specifically in specific communities. And so that was one of the very important parts of George Floyd's life, where his life was sort of on the knife's edge, where he's in college, things could go one way or they could go the other way. And in part because of institutional structures, in part because of sort of the sheer force of luck and luck of the draw, which happens a lot in Florida, his life ended up going in one direction. And there were so many moments in our book where we see those junctures where things could go one way or the other. And one thing we found about George Floyd is even as things went often the wrong way for him, he always picked himself up and was always willing to try again.
Geraldine, just staying on the subject of sports a little bit, last night we talked a little bit about your interest in horses, and I'm just really curious, we're all aware of your work in historical fiction. Can you just talk about the historical inspiration behind horse?
Sure. So racing in the 19th century was huge. It was the national pastime of the day. It was bigger than NFL. It was NFL if we all in our cupboard at home had a helmet and pads and played every weekend. Because everybody, it was an agrarian society. Everybody had a horse. So it was only one generation removed from having a horse. People loved to race their horses up and down the main street, which is how we got the American quarter horse. But the great rivalries between the fastest thoroughbreds of the day was a national obsession, North and South. And some of the rivalries between North and South were played out in the competition between the greatest horses. And thousands, like 40,000 people would go to the racetrack to follow these races. There were 3 newspapers purely devoted to horse racing. And so that part of the book was very easy to research because every hoofbeat that this horse took was documented in 3 newspapers. But of the people who were responsible for training him, for grooming him, and initially for riding him, all of whom were black and either enslaved or formerly enslaved, very hard to find their stories, to excavate what their lives were like. And so that was the challenge for me. But the inspiration was the idea of horse racing in a way as a metaphor for the coming apart of the country and the rivalry between North and South being enacted in the body of these beautiful horses who were very different to modern thoroughbreds in that they were built for endurance as well as for speed. So they were healthier horses. We've really done a disservice to the thoroughbred. They're so frail now, which is why so many end so tragically.
And can you just talk about, this is a process question a little bit, but how you decided to tell this story spanning 3 time periods?
Well, it was going to be 2, because the first I ever heard of this horse was purely by chance. I was at a lunch at Plymouth Patuxent Museum, and another guest at the lunch was from the Smithsonian, and he was telling his lunchmates how he'd just delivered the skeleton of the most famous racehorse of the 19th century from a forgotten corner of the attic in the Natural History Museum in Washington to centerpiece of an exhibit on the history of the thoroughbred in the International Museum of the Horse in Kentucky. So I was fascinated by what was the Smithsonian doing with this horse, and how did they use bones for scientific study, and all of that stuff that the old newspaper reporter in me gets fascinated by, just intruding in other people's lives and their business. And so I was able to get into we call the Smithsonian the attic of America. Well, the attic has an attic, because only 2% of what they have is on display in the museums, and 98% of it is in suburban Maryland, where in these great linked storage pods and laboratories is examples of some of the greatest human creativity and examples of every species known to exist on Earth, and every language that has been spoken is recorded there. It's an amazing treasure house, and my business was the funky corner of it called the Osteoprep Lab, and particularly the bug room, because bones are still cleaned by beetles. Anyway, I wanted this contemporary thread. The historical spine of the novel was obvious. It was going to be the story of the horse and the people who had cared for him. And then in the process of researching it, I became intrigued by a very mysterious painting of this horse that had fallen into the hands of an avant-garde gallery owner in Manhattan, and why she had this painting and why she cared about it when the rest of her career was all about Pollock and de Kooning and Bridget Riley, and my novelist's imagination realized there'd be a third strand as well.
Lily, I have a question more for process for you. You wrote The Light Pirate in 4 parts: power, water, light, and time. Can you just talk about how important the structure of your novel was, and what it made you think about in terms of humanity confronting these challenges?
Yeah, well, I really wanted to give the novel a sort of more than human perspective. I wanted the gaze of the book to be kind of hovering above these smaller human lives. And so in choosing to structure it with these elemental parts and giving each of those elements kind of its own voice in the book, it felt like I was finally able to tap into spans of time that, completely eclipse a human life, as, geographic scope of vision that completely eclipse what we can see ourselves. And so in doing that, it felt like I was able to make the book feel even bigger than it was, because at the heart of it, it's, spans one woman's lifetime. And that was also a really important framework for me. So much of the book is about climate change. And so in taking one lifetime, it felt like a way to both acknowledge the limits of our gaze as human beings and the obvious problems that have occurred with our inability to see beyond the end of our own lifetimes, to really care for the generations that will come after us. So to acknowledge that inability, but also to be anchored in like the span that we do have, right? Like we're here while we're here. And so, I think using those elemental pieces helped to kind of be more fluid with how the book was treating time and kind of move in and out of those perspectives.
Wow. Adam, I'm just really curious about this. For someone like with such a strong understanding of American history, I'm just curious, when you go into a project like, American Midnight, was there anything that you found in your research that just totally surprised you?
Sure. It wouldn't be fun to do this otherwise. I dive into a book, a time period or something, because there's some things that fascinate me there. Bait that draws me in, but then I find out things that I didn't know before, and I find out ways of telling the story that hadn't occurred to me when I started. One of the things I found out, for example, one of the subjects of this book, of the political repression during that 1917, 1921 period, was the press censorship that was so widespread in this era. Press censorship was provided for under the Espionage Act, and the Espionage Act gave to the Postmaster General the power to decide what went through the US mail. And in the days before the internet, before radio, before TV, before email, if you were publishing a national newspaper or magazine, the only way you could reach people was through the US mail. Well, who was the Postmaster General? Well, that power to decide what went through the mail, what couldn't go through the mail, landed in the worst possible hands. A man named Albert Burleson, who was a former congressman from Texas, arch conservative, arch segregationist. His family owned 20 slaves at the time that he was born. One thing that surprised me, where did he carry out this censorship program from? From the building that was Post Office headquarters, which 100 years later became the Trump International Hotel. And, Trump would have loved to silence dissenting media of all kinds. Well, here, the person who had been doing it 100 years earlier was in his hotel, where, incidentally, you could stay. The hotel was frequented by many lobbyists who were trying to curry favor with the Trump administration. For $4,000 a night, you could stay in the Postmaster General's suite. So that was something I learned that I didn't know to begin with, but I learned all kinds of other things as well.
That's really fascinating. Robert, I'm just really curious what it's like to collaborate on a book. I've never done something like that.
This guy?
It's not half the work, is it? How does it work between you?
Totally, I did all of, no. First of all, the tradition at the Washington Post, if any of you all still subscribe to it, is that co-bylines are very much in the culture of the Post. And when when people found out that I was working with Tolu, they would say, you guys will just hate each other by the end of it, but it will be okay, you know.
This wasn't specific to me, though.
No. It was just because that was how it goes. And so when you thought about writing about George Floyd, given the competitive nature and the depth of the reporting that would need to be done, it thought it would be good to collaborate with someone. And I thought it would also be good to collaborate with Tolu. Tolu and our personalities are a little bit different. People who are drawn to Tolu are not drawn to me. I think this may be the same for others. I haven't asked. But one of the things that it sort of allowed us to do practically was we were able to sort of combine the skills that we had as reporters and writers, which are kind of complementary skills. It also helps that Tolu and I know each other, and we've liked each other, and we respect each other, which meant there was very little fighting that became personal. The sort of debates we'd have would be over like the nature of using the F word too much and things like that. But practically how
Who was for it and who was against it?
Guess. I'll tell you if you guess.
You were for it.
I was not. So, but practically how we did it was Tolu and I, we essentially moved to two different parts of the country, and we did lots of interviews, and we shared all our notes in a Google file, and our editor saw it, and we had created a very detailed outline about how the book was supposed to play out. So the debates about structure were handled in the outlining process. So by the time that it came to write, we very much had a blueprint of what to do. I think it would be really difficult if you're expecting X from your co-author and co-author delivers you bananas, So we were working from that, and we pulled from each other's interviews, which was able to make the process pretty seamless. I hope it's hard to distinguish or discriminate who took the lead on different chapters, but there's not a single sentence in the book that wasn't approved by both Tolu and me. And I think it's also important to remember that, if we were writing about something that I felt personally passionate about, like the history of puppetry, the debates might be a little bit different, but we were both united in believing that the work that what we were working to do had such an important big purpose in terms of what it can help the reader understand, not just to add depth and dimension to who George Floyd was, but to really help people who are struggling with the idea of what systemic racism is beyond the theoretical academic exercise of it existing, how it would actually operate in the real world. And so we were both really focused on making sure that the reader took away something that could help unlock a part of the American experience that they did not have. And I think because we were guided by that principle, it made working with another person much easier than my former colleagues at the Washington Post said it would be.
Tolu, you look like you're nodding, so you agree with all this?
No, I don't agree with any of it. No, I agree wholeheartedly. And the only thing I'd add is, in addition to like the structural work of the craft of putting this book together, it was helpful to go through this process and the emotional parts of it with a partner who could relate to a lot of the things that we were discussing and writing about, who could commiserate with the process of trying to write for a broad audience and translate certain things and make sure that the book does what it's intended to do, which is to examine and explore and investigate the way systemic racism operates in America. And we were grappling with some tough stuff, some of the demons of this country, and trying to approach it as journalists with a little bit of an arm's length approach as nonfiction journalistic writers that aren't, activists or aren't personally involved in the story in terms of being characters. But we're human beings at the same time, we're not robots. And so it was helpful to be able to process a lot of the emotions that we had as we were writing about George Floyd's life, George Floyd's death, the aftermath of his death, the fact of what the country was beginning to do in the early aftermath of the backlash to the George Floyd protest in early 2021, where we started to see book bans, we started to sort of question how would our book land in the world. And so we had sort of some of these philosophical conversations, and a lot of times we were sort of leaning on one another to sort of reassure ourselves that we were doing the right thing, reassure ourselves that things would be okay, and also just kind of get through the very difficult process of writing a book generally, but also writing a book about a very tough subject matter. And so it was helpful to hop on the phone or have a text chain with our editor or hop on a Zoom and just sort of work through things. And sometimes those discussions would be very technical and very much focused on structure and craft, and sometimes we just sort of be a release for one another to just sort of talk about an interview that we had just done, and talk about sort of what we were thinking and how we were going to relax and separate ourselves from some of the trauma that we dealt with, and also talk about the joyful parts of the book, because some of the parts of the book that spoke to us the most were people reminiscing about their relationship with George Floyd, people reminiscing about what it was like growing up, even in impoverished circumstances, where they manufactured joy out of really tough circumstances. And that's one of the things we put in the book, was sort of this theme of the resilience of the Black family, the Black American experience. And we got to sort of jointly manage both the hard parts of the book with the more joyful parts and the joyful exchanges that we have with one another as well.
Yeah, I actually want to continue on with that theme, because it occurs to me, like, we're sitting here, probably all of you were working during the pandemic. This is the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. We're not at a time of peace. There's all sorts of fear and angst in the last few years. And I'm just wondering, because people ask me this, mostly young people ask me this. It's something I never really had to think about before, but what do you do for self-care? How do you're diving into this. It's not like you're reading these books. You have to write these books. Geraldine, what is it like working through, in this day and age, telling these kind of stories?
I can't really separate this book from the catastrophe that happened in my personal life before the pandemic, when my husband, Tony Horwitz, died suddenly. He was on book tour himself, and I just got a phone call, and my life was completely different. And of course, I was not going to be writing this novel again for quite a while. I was about halfway into the book, and I couldn't, I was in the mists for quite a long time. And then I got a piece of advice from a reporter friend who worked at NPR, who had got it herself from Ruth Bader Ginsburg at a time of personal tragedy, who said, "Do your work. It might not be your best work, but it'll be good work, and it'll be what saves you." And it was in the quiet of the pandemic, the enforced quiet, a year after Tony died, that I crawled back to my desk and found that what I had done was crawled into the lifeboat that was going to save me. So, I think, though, when I came back to the book, it was going to be a different book, because not only was it a time of grief and loss for me, but it was for everybody. So the second half of the book, I'm sorry, it is a bit of a downer.
Shocked by it.
Well, Robert.
I was shocked by the second half, and I was This is so embarrassing now that I'm on stage. But I was telling Geraldine backstage that, when the twist happens, I sort of clenched my chest, and then I said, I should have seen it coming, which was not a mark on the prose or the structure, but because of the conditions of the world in which the book takes place in the present tense. But there's a lot that I think is similar to this. When we were doing the reporting for this work, it was in the midst of the pandemic, which had its practical challenges, right? There were times when we'd be with the family of George Floyd, and they would have these sort of like chains with fans that were going around them because people would come up and hug them, and they were afraid of catching the virus, And it required us to be in homes of people who had loved him, and these are not palatial houses. And there'd be times where people would just sort of sit catatonically or playing with a cat puzzle, just contemplating what kind of country we're living in. And it was this kind of question that they were feeling in the personal sense, but also in the universal sense, right? Because we were all experiencing it. What I found was that the privilege of being a reporter and writing this book at this time was that in the telling of how people were processing this period, we were able to process it ourselves, that the solution to the angst was in writing about the angst and sharing that experience. And by the end of it, we did not know how this story would end. We had started writing a book without no conclusion. The man who murdered George Floyd, Derek Chauvin, had not been convicted. We had no idea what Joe Biden or the federal government would do. And toward the end of the book, it became clear that we were having a reversion of some of the wonder and some of the things that made people really excited to be an American that was happening when we started the book. And one of the most profound interviews that we had done was with the Reverend Jesse Jackson. And if there are any reporters in the house, I think we will all agree that Jesse Jackson typically is a very disciplined, distanced person to interview. He's not particularly vulnerable. I don't know if that's been your experience, Adam. And I said to him, how do you actually keep hope alive? That was the question. People thought they had it. They don't have it. How do you keep hope alive? And he said the most personal thing that I'd ever heard him say, which was he talked about being the same age as Emmett Till and how that knowledge haunted him and how much it had inspired him to go for peace and to become the person who he was. He carried that real fear that what could have happened to that boy from Chicago could have happened to this boy from Chicago. And he said, when you look at the whole of it, like when you take everything from a distance, you see progress in a way that does not seem apparent to you when you're up close. And so when you think about the way the country is moving, you have to remember that you're still winning. And I think about that a lot. And so when we think about writing, we don't traffic in tragedy for its own sake, right? But we know that when we document things fully, extensively, right? We can put the tragedy into context so we can understand the forward steps that are being taken.
Lily, I'm just going to jump on that. You're writing about the environment. You've seen hurricanes in Florida. The last several have been pretty devastating.
Yeah.
Are you hopeful?
It feels wrong to say no. Yes and no, both, I think. I think it's impossible not to feel cynical, right? I think if you don't feel a little bit cynical, maybe you're not paying attention. And I think it's important to honor that and to make space for hopelessness. I don't think that they cancel each other out. I think there's room for both. So yes, I have hope, and also I feel incredibly hopeless often. And I think, I really loved hearing your answers. I related to them so much. When I was working on The Light Pirate, I felt deeply sad all of the time by living in this world that was, drained of hope. And, but it's also my job to instill that back into it, which is a really thin line to walk, to both see it in all of its horror and also imbue it with something bright. And I think the process of writing the book was both the thing that was hurting and was kind of, a little bit masochistic, but was also the solution for me at the same time. Because, as much, as kind of enormous as the problem of climate change and all the problems that are threaded throughout our country and our world are, I think the most immediate feeling is what can I do? I feel like I can't contribute to this solution. And so for me, putting all of that energy into a creation and crafting something out of it and taking my characters on that journey was both, the thing that was hurting so much and what I can do about it. So it was both.
Adam, as someone who's seen the cycles of history, you're writing about a time 100 years ago. Are we learning from history, or are we repeating the same mistakes?
I actually think we are learning something from history. However severe the problems we're wrestling with right now, and I certainly would not minimize any of them that you could mention, whether it's climate change. Sometimes I think, if there's some other galaxy up there in space looking down at this galaxy here with this strange planet called Earth, they're wondering, are these people going to first blow themselves up in a nuclear war, or are they going to overheat their planet so much that they all fry? Which is going to happen first? Nonetheless, we're facing big problems. But I do think we have learned some things. The period that I wrote about in American Midnight 100 years ago, a lot of terrible things happened. Congress passed the Espionage Act that, as I mentioned, allowed the Postmaster General to censor anything that went through the mail, including printed newspapers and magazines, which he did with great pleasure and gusto. That law got changed. The Supreme Court at that time allowed unanimously the Espionage Act to proceed and allowed people to be imprisoned in considerably large numbers for distributing leaflets and pamphlets that they wrote that the government did not like. That law's gotten changed. I do think that today, for all our enormous problems that continue, people have a stronger sense of the importance of the First Amendment than they did 100 years ago. Does everybody have that sense? Absolutely not. But do a substantial number of people in this country have it? Yes, because when these enormous violations of freedom of speech took place 100 years ago, there were virtually no large public protests about it. So I think we have learned some things, and we have to learn a lot more fast.
Well, this is the end of our first half here. Can we just give these authors a great round of applause? Mm-hmm.